Just going out on something of a limb here after taking a cursory look around. If this doesn't smell to you ever so slightly like tool time, what does? I'm John Cadogan from AutoExpert.com.au, and I get new cars. I get new cars cheap. Australia only website. Card. Now, we do spend a long time on this channel talking about cars and automotive technology and car makers behaving badly. That's a personal favourite. But today is a welcome respite from all of that. It is ostensibly a review of this horizontal metal cutting bandsaw, short version. Get one, dude, if you want to lift your game and become a madman of metal manipulating mayhem. It's really that simple. It's also a love letter, I guess, of sorts to the ubiquitous angle grinder, which everyone has and keeps so many emergency medical professionals gainfully employed. I love these things and I hate them, despite owning 7. Okay, so, and yet I have all my fingers and toes and both my eyes work, so go figure. We're going to get into all of that and how this kind of thing is really not the Swiss Army knife of metal cutting that many weekend warriors think it is. This report is sponsored by NordVPN. Now, I'm not a hardcore IT guy, but I've heard enough, especially recently, about data breaches, scams and hacks to know that being online can be inherently risky and costly. You don't have to be tech savvy to use NordVPN. It's a simple one-stop cybersecurity solution. One click and you are protected from hackers, malware and pop-ups across as many as 6 devices. NordVPN is the world's fastest VPN. I don't even notice it running in the background, frankly, and it only costs about as much as a cup of coffee to keep your data, your identity, and your devices secure every month. NordVPN can also save you money because you can assign your virtual location to another country where, for example, flights and accommodation might be cheaper than they are back at home. The same goes for streaming services, and you can access live sporting events and other content that may not be available where you actually live. It's a pretty small price to pay for cybersecurity. Not to mention the potential savings also on the table. Go to nordvpn.com/AEJC to get a huge discount off your plan plus 4 months free. Totally risk-free with Nord's 30-day money-back guarantee. That's nordvpn.com/AEJC. Link in the description. And thanks to Nord for sponsoring this episode. Typically, for many of us, in between emerging from the womb and becoming a man, we have to go to battle with a piece of metal, and there's several fronts on which this battle is fought. Obviously, you can fight it on the front of drilling holes in metal, which is a topic for another day perhaps, but you've got to cut some up from time to time. You might want to make a workbench, you might just need to repair something, whatever, you've got to cut some metal. And the obvious place to start, you probably did this at school, is with a hacksaw. And hacksaws are good for the soul, but one has a limited supply of elbow grease, right? And the novelty quickly wears off, which means upgrading to a metal cutting power tool. And the obvious choice there is an angle grinder. However, one can do a whole lot of work with a hacksaw if one is sufficiently motivated. And if you want to see this in action, there's a fine young Aussie YouTuber whose channel name is Artisan Makes. He's actually a really clever machinist and he does some amazing work with some mini lathe, small mill kind of thing. He's got a bit of a shed with those kinds of basic small machine tools in it, and he just cranks out some amazing projects. So check it out. Anyway, he cuts up the stock, and some of it's pretty chunky stock, with a hacksaw. Bonus points. And bonus points, he often leaves his mistakes in, because the mistakes are part of the journey when you're in a place such as this, and they're a learning opportunity apart from anything else. So Artisan Makes is great, and he moves a whole lot of metal with a hacksaw, is what I'm saying. But for many of us, once the novelty wears off and we have to cut up, I don't know, several different bits of 50 by 50 by 3 or 4 mil wall thickness square hollow section tube to make a workbench, the novelty of doing this with a hacksaw really does wear off. And this is the reason a lot of people upgrade to an angle grinder, which can be cordless like this one, or it can be corded. The pro tip there, the corded ones are more powerful and they move a whole lot more metal, but they are more aggressive and easier to hurt yourself with. We'll get to hurt yourself in a minute, but cutting is obviously done with a thin disc such as this. These ones are really thin. They're only 1 millimeter thick, which means the small kerf is really versatile, but the disc is really fragile and it's moving really fast. So if you're so stupid that you remove the guard and you don't have both hands on the tool and it jams in the work and you're looking down the blade like this, like you're in the plane of rotation, where do you think the shrapnel is going to go? And if you use an angle grinder to cut all kinds of metal and there's a bit of cantilever load and you cut right through it and it jams on the job, or you're cutting a big piece of plate and it moves right at the end and it jams the blade, then that's a bad day for you. I also see a lot of people who cut like this, like the face of the tool is over here and they're not protected as they would be like this if they were cutting with the body of the tool between the problem and their face, essentially. Okay, now safety glasses always a good idea. Don't wear gloves, they're an entrapment hazard, blah, 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 okay? What I'm saying is that angle grinders have their place, and some of that place is cutting, especially if you've got to cut something that's hardened, like a piece of drill rod. You wouldn't want to do that with a bandsaw or any other kind of mechanical saw because it'll just trash the blade and you'll get nowhere. Abrasives are really good for that. If you do a lot of abrasive work, however, the air is literally full of toxic abrasive dust and metal dust, so the burden of PPE is very high when you use an angle grinder. And I'd suggest that mainstream cutting, like big cutting, is just not what angle grinders are good at, although you can do it. And it's quite dangerous unless you're really good at using one, all right? And a lot of people, based on some, cursory YouTube research, they're just not good at it. They do everything wrong. Guard comes off. They look at the disc. They're in line with it, whatever. It's just a terrible tragedy waiting for a place to happen, but it does keep all those emergency doctors and nurses gainfully employed at the weekend. So, swings and roundabouts there. They're really good at paint removal. Paint removal's quite safe because whenever you're using a disc such as this, it's down here. It's like this. There's a lot of physical protection when you're using an angle grinder like that. You've got a lot of metal between you and a failure, and in any case, there's not a whole bunch of really hard, heavy things to come off and aim themselves at you with a disc such as this. Flap discs, like on that grinder, they're very safe as well, comparatively, obviously, but they're really good at literally smoothing things over. Another sensational application for angle grinders, right, is a sanding disc, because you can get a rubber pad like this that comes with its own lock nut. You buy the sanding pads separately and they just go together like a politician could do it. They go together like this. You screw it onto the shank of the grinder and there is your less lethal option than, for example, a grinding disc, which is just a murder machine waiting to happen. It's a piece of reinforced artificial rock, and if it fails, at 10,500 or 12,000 RPM, whatever it is. So there's all of those considerations to think about when you're going to cut metal. And then there's also the burden of marking out and actually cutting it, because if you've got square tube to cut into a basic rectangular frame, like you're building a bench top or something like that, and you've got to miter it, which would be common, and you've got to miter, you've got to do 8 miters because there's 4 corners, 2 joints, 2 pieces of metal per corner, and there's 4 sides, and you really have to cut them separately. With an angle grinder, that's 32 separate cuts that you have to mark out, whereas if you use a saw such as this, it's only 8 cuts. And you don't have to mark them out completely. You just have to make a mark where you want the length. And the setup of the saw manages the 45-degree cuts and the 90-degree cuts that comprise the miter. So that's a huge benefit as well. So it is actually faster to do the cuts for that kind of thing with a saw such as this. Now, full disclosure on this saw, it's a BS-85 from Vevor. They sent it to me. I actually went on the hunt for the Weekend Warrior's ideal bandsaw, and we'll get into that in just a second, but I wanted to lay out the reason why it's a good idea to upgrade to this kind of device if you're going to do a significant amount of metal fabrication, because an angle grinder is more dangerous, fills the air with dust, burden of marking out, all the PPE you've got to wear to just get by with an angle grinder. And let's not forget, if you've got to do 32 cuts like that, you've got to clamp each piece 4 different times to cut each end. Like, it's either clamped to the bench or clamped in a vise or something, and you've got to move it each time to do each one of those. So you will actually cut the metal to get your fabrication project jigged up. You'll do it so much quicker with a bandsaw that it's just chalk and cheese, like you'll never go back. There are other metal cutting options that I wanted to talk about as well, just briefly. If you've got sheet metal to cut, you can get yourself a nibbler. This is a pneumatic one. You need a shop air supply to drive it, but it's really just a punch in a guide that'll do up to, like, I think it's 1.8 or 2 millimeters, whatever. These things are really good for just cutting profiles in sheet metal, even thick sheet metal, right? They're great. They're not particularly dangerous, and if you put a guide in place, you can cut straight lines as well, which is great. You can buy shears as well. Also, this is pneumatic, but obviously you can get the corded or cordless equivalent electrical tools as well. I kind of like air tools because they're not as difficult to manipulate in many ways as power tools. So grinders, for example, if you had some fine cleanup to do, you can always get yourself a die grinder like this with a mini flap disc. And this kind of thing works really well too, like much better than an angle grinder for sort of delicate work. So there's that to consider. And you also want to think about cutting long bits of metal up. Like, you buy steel, like low carbon steel, comes in long lengths, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 meters. And it's often quite heavy in those lengths. And if you've got a fixed saw somewhere, then you've got to carry the work to the saw and then cut it up and carry it back. And that's kind of hard work as well. So it's often nice to have something like this, which is portable. You can take the saw to the job and cut, 4 inches of whatever section you need off, and you don't have to move 80 kilos of steel to and from the saw to do that. So a portable bandsaw is not a bad idea, but frankly, you can do exactly the same job with the somewhat ubiquitous Recipro saw, the demolition saw. In America, you'd probably call it a sawzall, and you can get some pretty clever blades for them. I think I've got one here somewhere. The 2 flavors of blade that you can use for rough cutting with something like this, like you can just slide a little bit of cross section out, cut 4 inches of it off, and then fine cut it with some other device like this, for example. You can get bimetal blades for sawzalls. They're pretty good. They'll cut through carbon steel really well. You can also get these somewhat more high-tech carbide tipped blades, and they just eat metal. The big problem with Recipro saws is accuracy. It's hard to cut accurately, but you can just cut it roughly and then move the bit you want to the saw. Now, bandsaw wise, why did I choose this one? Like, I've got that bandsaw and another 2. In fact, I've been the proud owner of bandsaws for 15 years. I just checked my 6x4 bandsaw, which is sold around the world. There's 1 million of them reviewed in America. They sell exactly the saw I've got there at Harbour Freight. It's the same thing, just red instead of blue. I got that one in 2008. It's done a shitload of work and it's just been fantastic. The worst thing about it is the stand. It's terrible, but the saw itself performs really well. And if you tune it up, you get really accurate cuts. It's reasonably heavy though, but not as heavy as the one I bought, I don't know, a couple of years ago now, which is called a BS-7L, which has this massive cut capacity of 305 by 178 millimeters at 90 degrees. The problem with a saw like that, although it's great, like it's got hydraulic downfeed control using a damper and it's got a coolant pump system, so you can just, it's set and forget. You know, I wouldn't go out while it was running, but you can certainly walk away from it and do some other job while it's faithfully cutting a big hunk of steel. In fact, the steel that all of this is sitting on and that you're watching from now, because your camera is sitting on the steel, is a bunch of scrap I picked up. It's this 250 by really thick channel, and I cut it to length using the big bandsaw. So what I'm saying is bandsaws rock. The problem is if you buy a big one, you've got to have the floor space for it, and it's heavy, it's hard to move, and maybe it's not the right one if all you want to do is build some tubular steel frames and cut some flat bar and round bar in reasonably sane cross sections for DIY projects. You want to build a few gates or something like that just to upgrade the security of your home, and you've got the gates are always a bit bespoke. It's hard to just buy one off the rack that fits just right in the aperture you've got, so you tend to have to make it, right? And so I looked at what was a functional spec for the bandsaw you need for your fat cave, and I came up with the following sort of prerequisites, right? It had to be under $500 because we're not setting up Curtis's workshop at Cutting Edge Engineering Australia, which is another excellent YouTube channel in this whole machining DIY space. He does some properly out there work on D11 bulldozers and big excavators and things of that nature. And if you're interested in that, it's really difficult to stop watching once you've clicked. So check out Cutting Edge Engineering Australia as well. It's awesome. So under $500, which this one just scrapes in under. It's quick adjustment I wanted. I wanted to get quick adjustment from 90 degrees to 45 and back, because that's really kind of important. From time to time, you know, when you're cutting up your stock, what you want to be able to do is cut up 90 degrees and then you want to go 45. Do a 45 cut and then go back to 90 and cut that. And I've got to say, the other two bandsaws that are more substantial than this one that I've owned for some time, they're a proper pain in the ass to adjust to and from 90 and 45. Like, you've got to swivel the vise and it's not straightforward, whereas this saw has stops. It's just, and they're adjustable. You can tweak this saw. We'll get to tweaking in a minute, but the 90 to 45 adjustment capacity of this saw and this quick ratcheting adjustment lever here is really one of its best features in my view. Link in the description if you want to know more. You can click on that. And Vevor did send this to me. I'm not getting paid, however, to just talk it up, but they are prepared to give you a discount if you use the link in the description. So anyway, I wanted one-handed carry too, okay? I wanted to be able to pick this up and, if you remember, to lock the pivot. I just want to be able to pick it up one-handed and, you know, walk around, put it on the tailgate of the ute, move it to and from location simply, because sometimes it makes sense to fabricate something on location. And I've got to say, getting either of my two floor-mounted bandsaws to a location is, one's impractical and the other one's just flat out impossible. I mean, getting it out of the back of the ute and just sitting it on the floor here to make this workbench was pretty hard work. And without a forklift or a crane, which I've got block and tackle on a beam in the ceiling here, it just wouldn't have happened. You know, I might have been able to jury rig something up with an engine crane, or 10 mates. It's kind of that sort of proposition. So big tools are superficially attractive, you know, like the big drill, the big lathe, the big mill, the big saw. They're all aspirational somehow, but the reality is moving them around is a proper pain in the ass, and it's not all advantage, right? Like there's a huge advantage to just being able to move this saw. It tips the scales at just under 20 kilos, which is like about a fat kid's worth of mass, you know? So it's easy enough to move around. You can take it on site, no problem. And all the cutting that I did with this saw, I did it simulated off grid with my Bluetti AC200MAX, which is a portable battery inverter system that I've reviewed. If I can find a review, I'll stick a link in the description also so that you can watch that. But you could take this in Yo Ute and you could sit it on the tailgate, do all the fab on the tailgate, or do all the cutting at least on the tailgate, and you can power it without having mains 240 if you've got a device like the Bluetti. This is 1000 watts, so it's substantially less than the rated output of one domestic GPO. So that's good. And what else did I want? I wanted it to be not a toy, because there are plenty of tools, home workshop tools you can buy that are just toys that don't inspire one with confidence that they're going to last any substantial length of time. And you don't want to spend $300, $400, $500, whatever, get 6 cuts into an 8-cut job and just have it burn out on you. And I did flog the tits off this briefly. I haven't owned it that long, but I did flog the tits off it for about half a day and cut various pieces of metal, including... This is probably a bit ambitious for this saw, but it's within its rated capacity. It's 50 by 106 mil wall thickness, and it took about 3 minutes to do this cut. Now, you can't miter this section. It's beyond the mitering capacity of the saw, but it's absolutely in the wheelhouse for cross-cutting, and it managed it okay. If I was going to cut this sort of stuff up all day long, I'd move to one of the other bandsaws though, because it is pretty hard work for this saw. I just wanted to give it something of a flogging so that we could put in perspective its cutting performance. So there's that to consider. Right now, this BS-85, the cutting capacity is not tremendously straightforward when you're talking about bandsaws, because obviously the cutting capacity is different at 90 degrees than it is at 45. You can't cut the same size section at 45 because of the opening here and the way that moving to an angle is compromised, right? So the way this works, if you're thinking about buying a saw like this baby will cut at 90 degrees. It'll cut 85 millimeters of round section, like round bar or tube or pipe or something of that nature, and it'll do 85 by 105 rectangular. So and you've got to do the 105 horizontal, okay? So what I'm saying there is it'll only cut this section that way. If you try and cut it this way, which I did on this side, you might be able to see the different cutting marks. You can get through if you cut it vertically, but you don't get all the way through, and then you've got to reposition the job and do a second cut, basically. So I got through to about here, and then I had to repo the work. Cutting at 45 degrees, right? 70 millimeters round and 65 by 75 rectangular. So if you kept yourself to 50 by 75, let's say, for your fabrication jobs, if everything you cut is within that 50 by 75 rectangular silhouette cross section, you can cross cut and miter cut to your heart's content. All right, and most jobs like workbenches and things of that nature, tables, gates, you really don't need bigger section than that. But if you did want to cut 100 by 100, this saw will not do that, or at least it will not do that easily, and it's going to be a pain in the arse and beyond its rated capacity. Okay, so I'd move to a 6x4 kind of bandsaw if you were going to do that. But for the weekend warrior thing, I honestly don't see too many jobs where you'd need more than 75 by 50, and then you could miter and cross cut to your heart's content. And also the saw is, although there are hard stops built in that you can tweak, it's got a protractor as well. So if you want to do properly convoluted angular cuts, you can do that, and that's pretty easy. You just, you read it on the protractor, you clamp it down, Bob's your mother's brother. That's pretty simple. So I really like that. The blade tension adjustment is easy. The blades are about 25 bucks a throw, and you'll get hundreds of cuts out of a blade. So the economics certainly stacks up favorably compared with the zip disc for this sort of, you know, low carbon steel cutting. It makes real sense to use a bandsaw, because not only will you be safer using it, but it'll be cheaper as well, because the blades just last so long, and you don't have to keep throwing out, you know, spent blades and buying dozens of these things to do the same job. Okay, so it took me I spent about 90 minutes tweaking this saw, and it came out of the box reasonably accurate, And you got to say to yourself, what are we going to do with a saw like this? We're going to rough cut bits of metal so that we can place them on a work surface like a welding table or a workbench or something of that nature. And then we're going to clamp them or jig them into position, and we're going to weld them. So if our joints are a little bit out, that's not really going to matter, as long as when we fabricate the bits together, the gaps aren't excessive, and we can just join it all up, and the end result is square and true and all of those kinds of things, right? That's kind of important. And out of the box, this saw is good enough to do that. However, 90 minutes later, I had tweaked it somewhat, and the tweaking process is dead easy, right? The hard stops for 90 and 45 are just eccentric cams, and there's just a screw that you loosen, and you tweak 90, you tweak 45. I got my 90 pretty much bang on. It's actually hard for me to film that because I used an angle finder to measure the accuracy of the cuts, and with a neutral density filter on the front of the camera, which is polarized, it stops you viewing the LCD display on the angle finder, right? So short version is I took some photographs with my phone, which I'll show you now, and you can see for yourself after 90 minutes the accuracy I got with 90-degree cuts and 45s. And frankly, I could do a bit better with the 45s, but who has time, and do you really want to chase those last few decimal points of degrees, right? In my case, not really. So anyway, I was quite pleased with that. There are actually 3 things you've got to tweak when you drill down into setting up a saw to be quite accurate. You've got to get your 90 degrees horizontal and your 45 degrees horizontal. But there's a third angle you've got to tweak as well, and in a sense, this is the one that will do your head in much harder than the other angles, okay? So what I found with this saw was that in addition to the cams needing a tweak, when the blade moved through its radius to do the actual cutting job, it was on the way down, it was getting closer to the work. So instead of cutting, it's easier if I show you. If I'm cutting vertically like this, instead of cutting at 90 degrees, it was cutting like that, okay? And there's no adjustment per se for that kind of angle. So what do, right? Well, it's really difficult to start thinking about, well, how do I tweak the pivot? And that's the wrong way to look at an adjustment job such as this. So what I did was, it was pretty easy. I shimmed the vise. We'll talk about the vise in a minute, but all you've got to do is you've got to get this axis horizontally, you know, in line with the flat surface on the fixed jaw of the vise. So I just got a bit of brass, like some shim stock, and cut it off with the shears and shimmed just this edge of the vise here. And all that did was raise the flat bed of the vise up so that it's in line with the horizontal axis of the pivot. And now the blade moves at 90 degrees to the work when the work is clamped to the bed of the vise. I hope that makes sense, but that's how you tweak the 3 angles. And there's a bit of trial and error with all of that, and it took me about 90 minutes. I didn't rush, but I got some really good results, and I'm extremely happy with the repeatability and the accuracy of those cuts. And you can see them here, right? Like, this is probably a bit heavier. This is like, I don't know, might as well not guess. It's 65 by 12. That's a lot more serious as a piece of stock goes than your average backyarder would ever cut. And this saw just ate it. It ate it. It's really efficient at that. The other thing is you can see the surface finish of the cut, which is much better than you'd get with an angle grinder, much more accurate, burr-free, and although it's not a cold cut, it's not like a proper cold saw, you can pick up even a small offcut, which absorbs a lot of heat energy because per unit mass it absorbs a lot of heat energy from the cut. You can pick up the offcuts straight away, which you absolutely cannot do with anything you cut with an angle grinder. And although it does need some slight cleanup, there's a bit of burr, it's actually a really clean cut, and you could just go straight into fabbing with that. What I would do if I was going to weld it is I'd just weld prep I'd take the scale off and do a little bit of a bevel to increase the penetration if I was going to grind the welds, right? But basically it's a much better job than you would ever get from an angle grinder, and it's a whole lot quicker and safer. So there's that. Another thing to consider is if you're going to cut round stock, there's a lot of 90-degree cutting of round stock, and it's easy to mark out round cuts at 90 degrees. You do it like this, incidentally. You just get a piece of paper. If you've got to do it by hand and mark it out, you just get a piece of paper and you wrap it around at 90 degrees, and you just make sure that the paper lines up. And that's a good enough for fabrication estimate at 90 degrees. Just mark it out with a felt tip marker and cut it off, dude. That's brilliant. When you're using a saw like this though, you don't need to do any of that stuff. You just need to mark the length, stick it in the vise and clamp it down and cut it. So that's easy. The burden of marking out greatly reduced, saves you time, in other words, and reduces the potential for error also. And the other thing that's really hard to mark out on circles is miters, right? With a saw like this, you just mark either the inside corner length or the outside corner length, and then you just line up the saw, baby, and you go for it, and close enough. And if you're a few millimeters out, like the blade is only 0.65 of a millimeter thick, so, which is, if you're in America, that's like 25 thousandths of an inch. So if you're 3 millimeters out, it's easy just to say, oh, that's a bit big, and then just nudge it through again and cut 3 millimeters off. That's dead easy, and you just cut off a little tiny 45-degree offcut, and the blade will handle that no problem. It's much more difficult to do that kind of adjustment with an angle grinder. It's much harder to do it accurately, and you certainly don't get surface finish and cut quality like that, which will greatly improve the speed and consistency of the fixturing and welding that you're going to do subsequently. So for mitering, absolutely brilliant for marking all of that sort of stuff out. So oh, the vise. I meant to talk to you about the vise. With a lot of cheap saws, the vise is just fabricated, and that's kind of terrible because the vise is flexible. You know, it's made out of pressed steel, and it's just really not that good, whereas this is a cast iron vise, and I'm going to say that it's a little bit over-engineered for the job because I never got the sense that it was struggling to cope with any of the work I threw at it. And cast iron's really good at absorbing vibration and things of that nature. So you don't get an Acme thread, like it's a cheapish saw. It's affordable, certainly. You get a cover on the thread to stop it jamming up with the swarf that you cut, but it's a conventional screw thread as opposed to an Acme thread, which you get on a more expensive vise. There's that. The ball bearing guides are good. Everything's good, basically. It's easy to change the blades and all of that stuff. The base is a pressed piece of steel. So when you talk about tweaking a saw like this and making it accurate, you've got to say to yourself, well, it's on a pressed steel base, so there's some flexibility there, and you can probably see there's a little bit of flexibility there in the pivot. And, you know, you can still get cuts well within 1 degree of bang on. So for my money, that's really, really good. Now, what didn't I like? There's a couple of things I didn't like. I don't mind the setup, although I'm not a huge fan of the trigger, okay? So what you basically do is you plug it in, you arm the bomb like that, and then to make the saw run, There's a trigger switch. And to me, that just seems like belts and braces. Okay, so what I'm planning on doing is either just pulling the handle apart and wiring this trigger up to continuously on, and then I can just switch the saw on and off like that, which makes more sense to me. It strikes me that saws of this nature are not particular entrapment hazards, and you could always reach around and turn it off. There's no scenario in which I foresee needing a sort of dead man functionality on the switch. So to me, that's a bit belt and braces. The speed control is nice. And if you are going to buy a saw like this, one of the things that I would strongly advise is that because most of the teeth are fixed pitch, I think this is 12 or 14 teeth per inch, what that leads to at times with different cutting scenarios is harmonics, which give you chatter, that screeching, horrible chatter, which is also not that efficient from a cutting point of view. You've got a speed control here, so you can go from like, I think it's 44 to 80 meters per minute worth of travel speed. And the two variables to control chatter, right, are the blade speed and also the feed pressure. So sometimes you can control chatter by just slightly increasing the feed pressure, and at other times slightly reducing it. And frankly, I'm a huge fan of letting the saw do the work here, right? Because that'll make the blades last longer and it'll just reduce the risk that the blade's going to wander off, okay? So sometimes it's easy to find yourself just applying ever so slightly too much pressure, and the feedback effect is the blade starts to chatter, and then you lift off a little bit and that shuts up and the cutting just gets more efficient. What I find it's important to do with a saw like this is to look at the thing being cut and just to see the swarf being ejected. And if the swarf is being ejected, you are getting through that piece of metal, and therefore there is no imperative to increase the feed pressure. It's easy to press just a little bit too hard with a saw such as this. So the things I really liked in summary are the blade adjustment, from the deck adjustment, so that you can switch easily from 90 to 45. That is just a huge plus that I don't experience with my substantially more expensive BS7L, which was like $1,600. Changing from a mitre to 90 degrees with that baby, that's an endurance event, and it's a disincentive to do it. Like, it really is. So being able to do this for such a low budget saw is absolutely fantastic, and one of this saw's best features, as is the vise. The vise is over-engineered. Trust me, if there's a difference, over-engineering, under-engineering, take over-engineering every day of the week, dude, because it's awesome. The main body of this thing is cast aluminium. It's pretty high quality too. They've done a good job finishing it off. Although you can't see it from this angle, the pulleys that drive the blade do have a cover on them. Access to this screw is a bit of a bastard down here to change the blades, but it's not too bad. You just use a stubby screwdriver or an insert in a ratchet and you get access to that one, no problem. I think it's a good idea not to use cutting lubricant with a saw such as this, particularly if you're cutting, just low carbon steel, which people call mild steel. And that's because it is essentially the cheese of steel, and also because the pulleys in here rely on the friction between their rubber coating and the blade to drive the blade through the work. And I'm not sure how oil or other cutting lubricant, coolant, whatever, would affect the rubber long term. And there is a small thing in the blurb about don't use cutting fluid. So I did all my cuts dry, worked out just fine. Blade didn't overheat. It's all good, okay? I wouldn't worry about cutting fluid, in other words, is what I'm saying. It's actually really easy to convert this thing to a vertical bandsaw, and one of the first jobs I'm going to do, if you're interested in it, I'll show you how, is I'm just going to convert this to you can convert it to a vertical saw like this, but it's not very useful. So it's going to be essential to make a jig that you just put in the vise with a table on it like this, and then you've got vertical bandsaw capability, which is really good for cutting tapers and curves and things of that nature that are really difficult to cut any other way, including with the world's most dangerous, ubiquitous metal-eating machine that keeps all those doctors so gainfully employed. So a table is a really good device to make as maybe your first project with a saw like this, and then you'll essentially get duos saws for the price of one, which is always nice. The speed adjustment on the fly is good. The lack of manual effort. Can you imagine cutting this with a hacksaw and the result you'd get and the amount of effort required? Sydney in the middle of summer, you're going to work up a sweat, dude, and something like this, even though home handymen don't typically cut 65 by 12 that often, that's hard work with a hacksaw, and you won't get a result as good as this. And that dirty big piece of square tube, rectangular tube I showed you earlier, hacksaw, that's an endurance event, right? So it's reasonably quiet, although when it chatters, it does squeak quite loudly, and you might want to wear preemptive hearing protection for that, but at least you don't need to wear breathing protection when you use this, in addition to safety specs, which is always a bit of a problem because when you've got a mask on, it fogs up your specs, and that's a dead set bastard when you're using an angle grinder. I can't stress enough how dangerous it is to breathe abrasive dust, and in particular cast iron dust, but also metal dust generally. So breathing protection kind of not optional when you use abrasives, whereas no breathing protection required when you use a saw of this nature. Definite safety specs, don't wear gloves. Entrapment has it, okay? Now, the burden of marking out, like I said, greatly reduced, and it seems pretty powerful, this saw. Like, it says 1,000 watts, and I can't directly compare it to my other two bandsaws because the power it's different, because the other two bandsaws drive through a gearbox, whereas this is direct mounted to the drive pulley. So 1,000 watts, it's still a reasonable piece of, it's still a reasonably low power consumption, whereas my other two bandsaws, the 6x4 bandsaw gets away with 375 watts, which is half a horsepower. This is about 1 1/3 horsepower if you're in America, and the big bandsaw is 750 watts, which is 1 horsepower broadly, but the gearbox changes the torque, obviously, and then there's also a drive pulley adjustment for speed adjustment with the other two saws. So having speed adjustment by wire is significantly more convenient than having to unscrew the cover on a belt and pulley system and switch the pulleys over and retension the belt, which is a time-consuming pain in the ass, which probably explains why I just leave the speed on both of the other bandsaws set on the middle one, and I make most of the adjustments to the cut in terms of feed pressure and feed rate. So that's just how I roll with that. The dislike aspects to this saw, because that's important too, and dislike aspects validate any praise, right? Because that's how you know a review's not bent over. Not a huge fan of the trigger, right? I just don't see why it's necessary to have the trigger, and I'm going to take it out of play and just wire it on continuously and roll like that. Thanks very much. The accuracy, it's okay for fabrication out of the box, but you can make it much better if you've got the bits to do that. And by the bits, what did I use? I used a little engineer's square like that, and a 1-2-3 block. And dude, if you don't have a 1-2-3 block, they come in pairs. They're 1 inch by 2 inches by 3 inches, precision ground and hardened. It's very difficult to damage one. And they're so good at checking square. Like, that's how you do it. You just look down the edge. It's brilliant. It's much more difficult to do any sort of squaring up job with something like this because you've got to hold it there properly, and it's just, there's more burden with that. And that means it's easier to get something wrong. So sometimes you need a little square like that just to get into places that you might not be able to get into with a thick thing like this. But when you can get into something with a 1-2-3 block, this is the same for table saws, incidentally. If you want to check the 90 degree on your table saw, you just put one edge on the table and check the blade with the other edge. It's just the world's most robust precision piece of 90-degree validating equipment I can imagine. And I also, for the 45 degrees, I just pulled the precision ground bit out of my adjustable square, and I used that to tweak the 90-degree part of the whole equation. And it worked pretty well. And it didn't take that long, and it's kind of therapeutic doing that anyway, because, you know, it's so many jobs, dude. You can spend the whole day on the phone, and you can spend the whole day filling out reports and writing scripts and things of that nature. But when you actually get your hands on the tools, it's awesome, because, you know, you get your square out and you make a few tweaks and you do a test cut and you measure it and you go, yes, I achieved something there, right? This is something you don't get in a whole bunch of other jobs, seemingly, okay? Now, the feet, it's got these plastic feet. They're not adjustable. And that leads to, occasionally you'll get the saw in a location and it'll rock a bit, which is kind of a pain in the ass. It'd be great if the feet were adjustable. They're not. I guess you could make it adjustable, but just get a wooden wedge and stick it under the high one, and it takes the problem out of the equation. So in the scheme of criticisms, that's not a major one. And the end stop that comes with the saw is not that good, frankly. And what I'd prefer to do actually is, if I was working on a temporary, like, portable workbench like you'll see in the overlay vision for this report, then what I'd do is I'd clamp this or screw it to the bench, and then I'd just screw a block of wood in down the other end where I wanted the end stop, or piece of angle or something of that nature, and then the distance would be fixed and it's just less clunky, you know? So I think the end stop, it works, it's okay. Is it a design triumph? No. For just under $500, this is a real lift if what you're using at the moment for all of your heavy-duty metal cutting is the somewhat ubiquitous angle grinder. I can't overstate the benefit of being able to just simply unscrew one lever and go from 90 to 45 and back again at will with repeatability and accuracy. I can't do that in either of my notionally much more capable bandsaws, one of which is more than 3 times the price of this. And obviously, yeah, it cuts bigger pieces of steel, and most of those large sections go at 90 degrees. But mitering is such a big thing in the DIY fabrication space, because that's what tables and benches and shelving systems and all of that kind of thing are. And the other big advantage of a saw like this is, when you're not using it anymore, you pick it up and you put it on a shelf, and it does not consume what might be the most valuable commodity in your workspace, which is the floor space. Both of my other bandsaws, they sit on the floor, and when they're not cutting metal, guess what they're doing? They're just taking up space. Whereas this, it can go on a shelf, in the corner, it can go on top of your fridge, it can go anywhere out of the way, right? And then when you need to deploy it again, you need this much bench space and you put it on that, or you get a couple of sawhorses and a piece of plywood, or you go on location with your Bluetti and you put it on the tailgate of your ute and you fabricate a gate for your tree change block of land in the boonies, right? So that is a huge plus with a saw like this, and you can't do any of that stuff with a $1,700 BS-7L or whatever it's called, right? So that's kind of huge. And look, link in the description if you're interested in picking one up. I'm told they've got plenty of stock. If you use the code in the description, you'll get 5% off. And I'm not getting paid to talk this saw up, incidentally. If I didn't like it, if I couldn't get a decent result out of it, I was just going to give it back to them, okay? But I think I'll hang on to this one because it does a whole bunch of stuff that my existing bandsaws don't do, and I can't tell if I'm going to leave it in this fat cave or take it to the other one, but there's certainly a place for it in my fabrication life, and maybe there is for you as well. But if you're using one of these all day long for all kinds of cutting, I'd suggest it might be time to think about at least a bit of a rational upgrade.